I'm told that today is Star Wars Day, so I should say May the 4th. I don't know if anybody thinks that's funny, but apparently it is. Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to OMFIF's session on how Latin American sovereign borrowers are managing debt sustainability in the face of external shocks. And for anybody out there who's just woken from a deep sleep, there are quite a few external shocks about. OMFIF is, of course, the official monetary and financial institutions forum, and the raising of and the investment of, by central banks and the like, public funds is our meat and drink. Now, in about half an hour, we're going to have a panel of directores de crédito público from 4 of the region's countries, and I'll introduce them, of course, a little bit later. But please get ready with your questions for them, because that's going to be an interactive session with some audience participation. But before that, I'm delighted to say I have the honor and the pleasure of a conversation with an old friend, Dr. Mauricio Cárdenas, who joins us from Bogota. He's a research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University in New York. Where is he's moved? He's over there now. But he's probably better known in the DCM world, in the debt capital markets world, as the highly successful Minister of Finance and Public Credit in Colombia for 6 years during the administration of, we should say, Nobel Prize winning President Juan Manuel Santos. He's also been the chairman of the Board of Governors of the World Bank and the IMF, and chairman of the G24. So who better to talk about the global geopolitical outlook, which is where we're going to start this morning's proceedings, and the impact of that global geopolitical outlook on Latin America. So Mauricio, as we're going to talk in our sort of half-hour conversation about both Russia and China, I wonder whether that neat little formulation I came across a while ago, I can't quite remember where, is still valid. Somebody said that Russia is the weather, but China is the climate. I don't know if you've ever come across that. And I'm really not sure if it's as valid today as it might have been when somebody thought they'd thought up something very clever. But just absolutely off the top of your head, the bird's eye view, how optimistic, pessimistic are you feeling at the moment about the geopolitical environment globally? We'll focus on Latin America in a moment.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Chris, for having me in. I'm delighted to be in this conversation. I'm also very honored to be part of this meeting with the head of the public credit directorates at 4 different ministries of finance in the region. Very important positions and very important players in today's world, because as we will discuss, a lot of this has to do with debt. Debt, I think, is at the center of the conversation. Do we have too much debt? Can we have more debt? Is debt becoming too expensive? Is debt becoming a serious risk? Could we go back to the 1980s and have another debt crisis? I mean, debt is everywhere. So very glad to have these key players and key actors. To your point, am I worried? Certainly, yes. I'm very worried because there is a scenario that a few months, years ago, we would have considered a tail risk scenario. Is becoming more central. It's moving to the center of the distribution. And that, of course, is something to worry about. What is the tail risk? What is that tail risk that is becoming more central? Well, is the risk of a recession, a global recession, that hits countries with very high levels of debt coming out of the pandemic. It hits countries with high levels of inflation as a result of the pandemic in a way, but also exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And those are very difficult circumstances to deal for any minister of finance in any part of the world. Add to that, that we're also entering these new crises, the war in Ukraine crisis and the consequences of it, with very limited fiscal space. So 2 years ago, when the pandemic crisis hit, it was natural that the response was to increase government expenditures, cut on some taxes, raise public sector deficits. And that was actually something very helpful to deal with the pandemic. I think it made a bad situation something that could have been worse. But we don't have that fiscal space today. So countries that are facing a negative shock because they're paying more for their food, they're paying more for their energy as a result of the war in Ukraine, can't really have the ability to compensate that and provide more subsidies to people, reduce taxes. There's not much space to do that. So it's a scenario to worry. To summarize my response.
Okay, well, certainly you mentioned subsidies, and that's a crucial point in the energy question for all of the countries, for all countries, but all of the countries we're concerned with here. But you focused, a little bit there in your answer on economic things. I mean, the tail risk that has become more central is really one of global war, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, let's move then. Let's transition to geopolitics and see what this is all about. I guess we're having a war that at the surface is a war between Russia and Ukraine, but at a deeper level is a war between values, the democratic values, the values of the rule of law, the respect for the international order, and the economy, because we know very well that this invasion of Russia in Ukraine has negative economic consequences. What will prevail, the values or the negative economic consequences? Are governments, countries throughout the world at one point going to give up because the economic consequences are so big that they ignore the values, or are they going to defend the values? I really hope that the values prevail and that we confront this aggression, as has happened until now, with determination and with a strong defense of the values that have shaped our societies, which are the values of respect for sovereignty, respect for independence, and of course respect for human dignity. So it's that confrontation of values versus economic consequences.
And you suggested, I think, in your remarks that we can think ourselves perhaps pleasantly surprised. Some would disagree, but we can think ourselves pleasantly surprised by the degree of unity of people who are willing to take the economic pain in order to stand up for the values you discussed. Just very quickly, has it surprised you the degree to which what I suppose we still call very vaguely the West, most of Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, has it surprised you the degree of unity?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's been remarkable. Not too long ago, we were discussing whether NATO had a role, whether it was an organization with a purpose, or whether it was just a waste. And I guess we're now seeing the value of it and how countries basically are really working together to fight this aggression. But Europe, to me, I think that's the most important aspect here, and particularly Germany. Seeing Germany taking the positions that it has taken, I think it's a show of unity at a time where we had seen in the past few years since Brexit, and not just Brexit, but politicians all over the continent in Europe being very skeptical about the European Union. Now, European Union is seen as something that has been truly an example of unity, and essentially has shown again the role that it plays and the important role that it's playing right now.
I think you're right to highlight Germany, because that's really thrown up some of the oddest political results I wouldn't have predicted, where you find the Green Party now holding obviously greater influence in German national political life than in recent years, certainly. Being a kind of, not being bellicose, that would be the wrong way to put it, but being supportive of a strong military and political response, military in brackets, but political response to this invasion. And you do see now Germany maybe starting to do what Mr. Trump was suggesting Germany should do a couple of years ago, all of a sudden under a brand new government, and that is very surprising. From a Latin American perspective, I think probably all of this still does feel rather distant. Countries a long way away, little direct economic linkage between Russia and Ukraine and most of Latin America, obviously some trade in food and things of that kind. But what are the channels through which the repercussions from this invasion can affect Latin America? Energy is very obviously one of them, so please do talk about that, because I know you have, I read a paper you contributed to on this very topic, but let's not just focus on energy, but where do you see the main repercussions as they can affect Latin America?
Well, yeah, let's put energy on hold for a minute, because I think the most important repercussion, it's on inflation. That's really what affects people in the streets. And that's something that could be potentially very problematic, because remember that right before the pandemic, and in some countries during the pandemic, we had a very significant wave of social unrest. So there's tension there. There's tension in the streets. It's been applicated somehow this year because of the fact that we're having presidential elections and the attention in some presidential elections. But the source of the unrest is still there, and it's related to the high levels of poverty that actually increased during the pandemic. So if you add to that the increase in inflation, which actually has a very negative impact on poverty, then what was a problematic situation 2 and 1 year ago, it's now even more problematic, because at any point in time, we could have social unrest, social explosion, the expression of social tension. So inflation is the way that I think is the channel that would put at the top of the list in terms of the consequences of the war in Ukraine for Latin America. Why is that? But obviously because we're seeing an increase in food prices and in energy prices. Food prices are now at the peak. The Food and Agriculture Organization started calculating about 30 years ago food price index that of course combines wheat, corn, sugar, a number of products, and that index, since it was created, has never been as high as it is now. We are having the highest food prices we've ever seen since that index is measured. And of course, energy prices. Now, energy prices are partially affecting people because governments have been very reluctant in terms of increasing fuel prices. And the main reason is precisely the social unrest. They're fearful that this could generate and trigger reactions on the part of the truckers, blockades, things of that nature. So countries have taken a significant part of the increase in energy prices, and this is affecting the fiscal balances, something that we should discuss later, because this, of course, has to do with the fiscal outlook and debt, in particular, the topic of our public credit directors.
Some countries, of course, indeed including your own, benefit from increased oil prices, but that doesn't stop that kind of inflation being channeling through to, as you say, potential social unrest. And of course, Colombia was, we have to admit, one of the places where that was most marked a couple of years ago. But countries that are that produce no energy and indeed not even a great deal of food, thinking of perhaps the Central American countries, are just getting knocked for six both ways, aren't they? And
you're right. You're absolutely
that's a
right.
real danger.
I emphasize the inflation channel, but let's talk a bit about the trade channel. And then we have, significant differences. And there are clearly countries that are net losers in terms of the terms for trade, and of course, in terms of the impact on their GDP. So it's not just inflation, it's also a negative shock to the economy. As you say, clearly Central America imports food, imports energy. The Caribbean is the same thing, compounded with the effect of tourism, because the war is negatively impacting tourism. So Central American and Caribbean countries are really going through a difficult phase. I think one of the best examples of what's going on in that part of the world is the Bahamas, which could have a negative shock of that you can measure in double digits in terms of the GDP contraction. And there's some special cases, isolated cases now that we're focusing on the Caribbean, of net winners. And the best example there is Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is a country that exports natural gas. Its price is going up, obviously, and fertilizers. So Trinidad and Tobago is having a significant positive economic shock. In South America, things are a bit more, they're not as clear cut, because South America exports food, but some countries are also importers of energy. So they're not big gainers and losers, but you could put on the list of countries that tend to lose with this: Chile, obviously, and some countries like Argentina and Paraguay are experiencing better prices for their food products, but much higher prices for their energy and much higher prices for their fertilizers. So things are a bit, less clear cut. Let's put it that way.
Of course. I want to come back to the terms of trade in a second, because I want to look at it from the other side, the other, if you like, the glass half full version of the narrative. But before we do that, are there any other ways in which this war directly affects our region? I mean, are there security implications for the Latin American countries? I mean, clearly, we've seen some very, very forthright commentary from the US administration. The US administration is obviously very, very focused on what's going on in Eastern Europe at the moment, much less so, of course, and this began before the war began in Ukraine, much less so on the Middle East. But, the US always goes through cycles of taking its eye off Latin America and then having a little sidelong glance and then saying, oh, no, that seems all right, and taking its eye off again. But either in terms of US policy or generally in terms of the geopolitical shifts of the world, are there channels, non-economic channels, for effects in Latin America? Take security as one example.
Yeah, well, let me touch three: security, again, trade, and let's talk a bit about the financial market implications. We haven't discussed those. There's a very important speech that was given by Secretary Yellen at the Atlantic Council about 2 weeks ago, right before the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. It's worth reading that speech, because what she says there is that as we embrace globalization and we're very much in a world that has increased its interdependencies, now countries begin to realize, and especially the United States, that not all of those interdependencies are necessarily good. A few years ago, the US started talking about reshoring, bringing back some production from China into plants in the United States, back into the mainland. Now, a few months after that, they talked about nearshoring, essentially locating plants nearby, especially in Mexico, Central America, even Colombia. In that speech, what Secretary Yellen is talking about is friendshoring. So production has to be located in countries where you engage in trade, countries that are reliable, predictable, trustworthy. And of course, that means, in my view, an opportunity for Latin America, because Latin America is the type of region that engages in trade without the intention to start a war, has never started an international war. Well, the Falklands are one exception, but essentially no international war. So this is a region that can provide and supply the world of food, of energy, without really putting a geopolitical risk. So I see an opportunity there.
Yeah.
Security-wise, let me touch on the security question. I think Venezuela still a very unstable, problematic, and a country that has generated a lot of instability in the region. Whether the war in Ukraine is going to change things in Venezuela, it's hard to say. Yesterday, Secretary Blinken spoke with Juan Guaido, the president of Venezuela. It's called the shadow president of Venezuela.
Briefly recognized by a number of people.
Briefly recognized, yeah. Saying that the United States was still quite supportive of him, and that I guess it was a way of saying, make no mistake, our trip to Caracas and talk to Maduro and potentially increasing oil production is not changing our view that Venezuela needs a change. And I guess that was just reassuring to the opposition and many countries, including Colombia, that was the countries that were worried about these possibility of the U.S. Coming to terms with Maduro. But I think Venezuela is still a source of instability, because we all know the connection between Venezuela and Russia, and that, of course, I think should be a concern. And my final point is about financial markets. Financial markets have not responded really to this war. They have been relatively muted. There was an initial increase, but very short-lived increase in spreads, in country risk premiums, but not lasting. So are financial markets going to react to the possibility of a global recession, the increase in interest rates, the expected and predictable increase in interest rates in the United States and in other central banks throughout the world? Is this going to be a situation where there's going to be a restriction in terms of financial flows, which of course could trigger another type of economic reaction, very different to what we have seen so far? So those would be my three elements. I think one is positive, this friendshoring. One is it's negative, the eventual reaction of the financial markets. And there is one big question mark, which is what's going to happen with Venezuela in the midst of this conflict.
Yeah, well, I too read Mrs. Yellen's speech, mainly because you pointed me to it. And the term friendshoring stood out to me. But that does seem to be, there's definitely, there's a carrot and a stick in there, isn't there? There's, if you support us politically, essentially, I mean, in terms of things like UN votes and that kind of stuff, then we'll be friendly to you economically. So, it was a little bit like what we saw, 20 years ago with the global war on terror, and your own country being a notable supporter of the then US regime's policies on that, and Colombia got rewarded as a result. And this seems to me a little bit of the same sort of thing, that Uncle Sam is saying, agree with us and you'll get some economic benefit. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not underhand, it's quite open. And your point about Venezuela seems to be an interesting one, that in Mrs. Yellen's speech, there was the sort of suggestion that Venezuela could somehow be rehabilitated. Again, a similar sort of thing, soften up a little bit and you can fill some of the hydrocarbons gap, plug some of the hole. But we have to bear in mind that Venezuela's production at the moment is about 10% of Russia's. So it's not going to fill a huge gap, it's fair to say. We've only got a couple of minutes left, Mauricio, so I do just want to touch on a couple of other things. as Mauricio recommended it to me, I recommend to the rest of you to have a look at what Secretary Yellen said, by the way, and particularly this notion of what amounts to a new Bretton Woods architecture, and the multipolar world, and plurilateralism, which was a new word on me, which may be one that Janet herself has just invented. But we can't cover those things in detail. I want to cover two topics with you really quickly, Mauricio, a couple of minutes each. One is, where is China in all of this? Because China, at the very start of the war, looked like a sort of soft supporter, or not, that's not even so soft supporter of Russia. It feels as though that has gone away somewhat. There were reports in the news this week of US intelligence agencies saying they had been unable to detect any clear support of Russia economically or militarily. So where does China sit in all that? Because China doesn't want to blow up the world. It wants to rule it and sell it the stuff that it produces. So tell us about China. And then the last remark, I'm afraid, is going to be about Colombia. So let's save a minute or two for that as well.
Sure. So a word on China. China is worried about its own problems. China, of course, it's seeing this new wave of the COVID crisis. And that's just a reminder for all of us in this conversation that COVID has not gone away. And we should not assume that we should not worry about vaccinations, equipment, testing, because this seems a thing of the past. Now, it's still there and still a risk. And if you don't agree with this, take a look at what's going on in Shanghai. They're also worried about slower growth. China is going to grow much less this year than last year, and it is something that is, of course, problematic, not just for their own sake, but also for the world at large, and especially for Latin America, a region that is so dependent on trade with China. And you're right. My sense is that, well, at least in the last few days, China has been talking less about this strategic relationship and friendship they have with Russia. And I think they're understanding the consequences of siding with Russia. But having said that, they're still buying energy, especially oil, at a lower price, at a discounted price, because that's what Russia is doing. And India is in that same situation. But I saw that speech, to go back to that speech of Yellen, as a warning to China and India that there will be consequences. So anyway, my sense is China is worried with their own internal problems, and will avoid taking a more, I'd say, stronger position in support of Russia on some language that was interpreted in that way in the early stages of this war.
Well, I mean, one thing we don't have time to talk about, but we should have scheduled an hour. But the Middle East, of course, is an important actor in this. At the moment, looks like it's hedging its bets in terms of the war, very much so, in fact. And you see the behavior of Turkey is also highly relevant to what's going on in that part of the world. But the Middle East, of course, could be something that could bring the Chinese closer, if you like, to a sort of Western orbit. That may sound absurd, but if they could compete with the Russians in terms of energy supply to China. I'm going to quote to you what a young man called Fabian, whom I correctly identified as being from our part of the world, turned out to be from Cali. Is a young man who sold me a sandwich just across the road here in London about 2 hours ago. And I said, "¿Qué tal, Gustavo Petro? You know, what's going to happen?" And he said, "Well, why not? You know, why not? Why not, Petro?" He said, "All this talk about communism, we don't need to worry about that. This is going to be capitalism for all, not communism." So I can see Cesar is looking away. I'm not going to ask you this question, Cesar, I promise, when we get to you. But I can ask you, Mauricio, because you've been a politician, and I hope maybe one day will be a politician again. But what is your elevator pitch for what's about to happen on the 29th of May?
Well, just as a refresher to people that are not so familiar with Colombia, we're having elections on the 29th, as you just said, but then we have runoff elections 3 weeks after that. So everything points in the direction that there'll be a runoff, and that the runoff is going to be between Gustavo Petro and Federico Gutiérrez. Very different models, very different conceptions of the world. I think as different as they get, and a very divided electorate. And very tight polls for that second round. In the first round, it's clear, at least based on the number of polls that are available today, that Gustavo Petro has the lead, and a significant lead in that first round, but not so much in the second round. He still has an advantage in this runoff. So if you ask me today, based on the polls, he's the likely winner, but that can change because the trends are favoring Federico Gutiérrez. He's been generating momentum and has been growing in the polls. Now, the more important question is what would happen under either one of these two scenarios. So Federico Gutiérrez will be very much continuity, business as usual. Essentially, teams that have been, running things in Colombia in the past administrations, those will be the type of people that would be in charge. With Gustavo Petro, it's more of a question mark. What is it that he really intends to do? So let me put this into extreme views. There is one view that thinks that Gustavo Petro is modeled after the autocrat, the Latin American autocrat that will try to change the constitution to be able to get re-election. He says no. He says he's not going to do that. He even went to a public notary and signed there that he was not going to do the things that he's being criticized for, like expropriation. But that is there. That risk is there. People have that perception. So that the negative sentiment towards him is essentially because of that. But he could also turn out to be more moderate. He was a mayor of Bogota. He didn't do extreme things, and he could, very likely appoint a technocrat as finance minister, just like Boric did in Chile, and send a message of calm and comfort to the markets that someone reasonable is going to be running the Ministry of Finance. We don't know yet. We don't know which one is really Gustavo Petro. So that uncertainty, of course, is something that makes many people uneasy.
Okay, well, El Chico del Valle, who sold me a sandwich, he says it's all going to be fine. So, these street polls, ask the taxi driver when you arrive in a new city, you usually get a flavor of something.
Let's hope he's right. Let's hope he's right.
He's right. Mauricio, as always, an enormous pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very, very much indeed for accepting our invitation. I hope to see you before very long, whether here or there or in New York. But thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. And do please stay on during the panel if you'd like to hear what...
listen to this great lineup of the public credit directors. Thank you so much for having me in, Chris.
All right, great stuff. Thanks, Mauricio. Okay, so now we switch to the panel format, and I should say the people who want to ask questions, and I know there's several flagged up in advance that they would, I don't see them yet in the chat, but if you want to ask a question, just put it in the chat. The guys, my colleagues here are monitoring that, so they'll flash it up to me. You can write them in Spanish or English if you wish, whatever you like. So let me introduce our panel. First of all, Herman Camil is the head of sovereign debt management at the Ministry of Economy and Finance in Uruguay. He's a long-standing guy in that post, retained by the incoming government in 2020. He is joining us from Montevideo. From Santiago de Chile, we have Patricio Sepúlveda, who's the head of the public debt office. They're basically all got the same job, all these guys, but they have slightly different titles. But so Patricio is the head of the public debt office in the Ministry of Finance of Chile, and he's a true veteran in that position. He's placed over $120 billion worth of bonds, by the way. So that's quite a lot of bonds in anybody's book. Thirdly, a newcomer, by contrast, to this world of Latin American DMOs, and absolutely delighted to see a woman filling this post. We have Maria del Carmen Bonilla, Deputy Undersecretary for Public Credit in the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico. welcome. Thank you for joining us from Mexico, representing the UMS, of course, the borrower in its official market name. She's a long-standing banker, derivatives trader from HSBC and Santander. So you bankers who are going to pitch her better know what you're talking about, because she'll spot the holes in your presentations for sure. Cesar Arias is General Director of Public Credit and National Treasury at the Ministry of Finance in Colombia. He's been in his job there for about 3.5 years. Before that, he was Chief Economist for Latin America at Deutsche Bank, and also worked at Fitch Ratings. And given that ratings is one of the topics that I think we'll try and cover, spend a few minutes on, Cesar, maybe you'll have a unique view on that. I don't think I've missed anybody out, so I'm going to go straight in to our first question. Well, if anybody wants to sort of raise their hand and say that they disagree violently or endorse wholeheartedly anything that Mauricio Cardenas just said, by all means do that. Anybody want to comment on what Mauricio just said? 3, 2, 1, no? Well, you'll come back to it. It'll filter through. So I just want to sort of, as we do in these sessions, just move gently into the conversation by saying that, if we kind of cut the last couple of months from our memories, 2021, generally speaking, felt like a period of macroeconomic optimism, because the rebound from COVID-19, not unilaterally, but in many places, looked much better than it had been feared, the macroeconomic rebound. Can I just ask each of you what have been, I expect you'll just say fiscal, but what have been the lasting impacts of pandemic in your countries? Marie Carmen, why don't I start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the OMFIF for inviting us to this great opportunity of having a dialogue of what could potentially happen going forward. Actually, I think that as it was mentioned previously, one of the long-lasting shocks we have post-pandemic has to do with trade, no? And trade connected as well with shortages of some type of semiconductors, especially in Mexico. That had an impact, of course, on some industries. This was being potentiated in the negative way with the war, and of course these tensions have made an outlook that is challenging going forward, because we are facing all across the board, and not only Mexico, I believe many countries, inflation impacts because of additional shocks on the supply chains. So originally it was only allocated on semiconductors and some type of metals, but as this conflict has been evolving, it has been transferred to other type of commodities, no? Especially oil, gas, and also food, raw materials. So this is very important, because the outlook, this good outlook we have by year end in 2021 began to turn unclear. And in this sense, right now we are experiencing an environment that inflation is making threats with these upward trends that are supply-sided. We're coming from a big monetary stimulus from the central banks, and right now additional fiscal policies probably should be required to strengthen the monetary outlook, because these shocks are on the supply side. No?
Yeah, supply chain hangover from pandemic is the main. Cesar, can I turn to you? Lasting impact of pandemic, just briefly on that particular point, though, if you would, and then I'm going to come back to some of the points that Marie Carmen has raised about what has happened since.
Well, Thank you for the invitation, Chris. It's a pleasure to be so well rounded up with these distinguished panelists and with my former minister, Mauricio Cárdenas. So it's a pleasure to be here. I think we are very constructive and optimistic here in Colombia because on the one hand, the pandemic was clearly the sharpest and deepest shock that the Colombian economy faced. But on the other hand, we're experiencing the most important recovery in our recent history in Colombia. And I'm gonna just mention two variables which are very important, and it's economic growth. Colombia contracted 7% during the pandemic, but last year printed a rate of growth of 10.6%. 10.6%. That's the fastest and the largest in a century. But more important than that is that with the 2 monthly prints of economic growth, January and February, we can now forecast that the Colombian economy is going to grow something between 7 to 8% in real terms in the first quarter of 2022. So Colombia grew 3 times faster than potential growth in 2021 and twice faster than potential growth in 2022. There was an objective that any economist in Colombia will hope to see, which was to close the output gap in Colombia. And I'm very pleased to see that before we leave office, Colombia has closed the output gap of the economy 24 months out in the pandemic. And on fiscal, yes, Colombia had to increase the debt burden by 15 percentage points from 50 to 65%. But we're also seeing already evidence that Colombia was able to reduce the debt burden by 1 percentage point in 2021 to 64%. And with the numbers that we have now, is going to be able to finish this year very close to 61%. And we have a new fiscal rule that we implemented, whereby our new debt anchor for the long term is 55% of GDP.
And what's the timing on that? If there's a rule, is it fixed to a particular timetable?
Yes, 10 years, which is our fiscal financing planning, but we're doing half of the job in 2 years.
So 2 administrations, essentially.
Yes, but we're doing, again, half of the job in 2021 and 2022. So that gives credibility to that. So just to summarize, I think, what are the lessons learned from the pandemic? In our case, policy flexibility and coordination between the central bank and the fiscal authority. Second, institutionality. That works pretty well. And third, a permanent process of consultation with society.
Okay.
Society doesn't want to be governed. They want to co-govern. And that is very important as we approach the post-pandemic world and hopefully the next couple of years in the case of Colombia.
Cesar, I think you should run for office yourself. You convinced me, that's for sure. And you kind of echo, you said in a much more eloquent and technocratic way what the young Colombian I spoke to this morning said. Patricio, let's focus on these. That's a fantastic story from Cesar. Let's focus though on these exogenous risks. No doubt there are many, but looking at 3 external shocks: inflation, rates, and war. In truth, all 3 of those were well telegraphed during 2021. Even the war, I mean, we'd been watching for most of the year troop buildups on the Ukrainian border. So you know, we could all be optimistic that it didn't mean anything, but of course, in the end, it did. So, but all three of those things were previsible, whatever the word, to be foreseen. Did you put plans in your plans related to any or all three of those?
Yes, Chris. So first, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleague from the other country, and also to be here with Mauricio Cárdenas. So I think that I think for Chile, I think that for many countries in the region, the level of debt, as Mauricio mentioned, is key element here. In Chile, for many years, we tried to maintain a level of debt reasonable. So we have previous the pandemic a level of less than 35% of GDP. We also, in terms of to be prepared in instead like shock, important saving in the sovereign wealth fund that we have in Chile, the Economic and Social Stabilization Fund, and the other one. We have a very clear objective in terms of the composition of the debts, and this composition is effectively to be prepared in order to be flexible and to access to different markets, and also to shorter the issuance of the debts, effectively to respond to different situations related to the economic growth. We also, during the pandemic, experienced in Chile a different withdrawal from the pension fund. So the local capital market was importantly affected by this in terms of liquidity, in terms of debt. So we changed a little bit the composition. The goal of the Chilean government is to have about 80% in local currency and 20% in foreign currency. So during the pandemic periods in 2020 and 21, we issue more in the external markets in foreign currency. And we have right now 65% local currency and 35% in foreign currency. Sorry. So and over time also we have had many efforts in order to build the different curve in the foreign markets, effectively to be prepared and to access easily to those countries or to this market. Sorry. So it was the first tools or maybe element to be prepared to affront or to affront the different external shock. The second one, I think that is the average term of maturity of the government. It was previous to the pandemic about 12 years. So we effectively reduced this, and we have now at the end of last year 11.3 years average term of maturity. So we decrease this one, but we still a very well or very good level of term to maturity in order to be prepared and not to be affected by effectively too much regarding the inflation. That, as Mauricio mentioned, we are experiencing inflation outside in Chile. Also, we have inflation 8%, and we expected that will continue to be persistent. So I think that this is the two main elements. The other one is, of course, to access to and to extend our investor base through the thematic bonds that we issued since 2019. It's a key element also. But I think that the two first one for Chile is very important, and we think that we did a good job.
Okay.
Last year we issued about 29 billion in local market and external markets, and so I think that we are prepared for the shock that we experienced last year, and maybe in the future we have to be always prepared to a potential new shock in the world.
Absolutely, Patricio, thank you very much indeed. Herman, quickly from you, we've sort of lost sight of the original question I asked, but each of you has kind of given an opening statement, if you like, and that's absolutely fine. What's yours, Herman?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation, Chris, to the panel. Just to put it in context and react to some of the opening remarks by Mauricio, as he mentioned, there are a series of shocks that are negatively impacting the global economy and are hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. The war in Ukraine that we've seen has further weakened the overall economic prospects because it comes on the heels of a global pandemic. And what we see in there is a sharp escalation in the price of food, fertilizers, energy, and that is compounded with supply shortages and trade restrictions. And that's affecting mostly broadly the population in middle and low income countries, and food insecurity now has come to the fore. So basically, we are coping with overlapping crises. Yet, the capacity that many governments around the world have to react to these multiple shocks has been limited, given the massive fiscal stimulus that were provided during the pandemic. Now, in the case of Uruguay, we were also obviously hit by the pandemic. It was in 2021. We were able to go unscathed in 2020. And then the government launched a massive vaccination policy, which ended up being our main economic policy, because it allowed us for a faster renormalization of economic activity. But I guess the key point that I wanted to highlight in the case of Uruguay is that the uncertainty around the world has increased, it has heightened, both for health reasons and financial reasons. So precautionary behavior on the side of governments is key. Being prudent about managing fiscal finances is ever more relevant, given that one is not clear what is the persistence of the different shocks. So in the case of Uruguay, the new government that took office 2 years ago introduced a new fiscal rule, as opposed to, say, Chile or Colombia. We didn't have a fiscal rule before, so we introduced a new one, which had 3 pillars. And the government was able to deliver on the 3 pillars of the fiscal rule 2 years in a row. And trust me, I've working here at the Ministry of Finance, I was able to see firsthand all the political pressures on the minister and other authorities to increase spending throughout the last 2 years. And spending was increased, but in a very focused way. So, and that is allowing the government in 2022 to be able to increase government spending or increase the rate at which, say, for example, public sector salaries increase without jeopardizing debt sustainability. So the way you manage your public finances through the cycle, through the COVID cycle, and the recent war in Ukraine ends up having a key implication for the way the sovereign risk is perceived in each country. In the case of Uruguay, fortunately, we have the lowest MB spread in Latin America today, which is something that was not usual for the country to have, the lowest sovereign risk perception. And a lot has to do with that fiscal prudence and the way the COVID-19 was managed.
Okay.
And my last point that I wanted to make is regarding the point that Patricio was making about which are the margins that governments has built into their sovereign debt financing strategy that helps them react to these different multiple shocks, and many of them unexpected. And he mentioned several margins that I would also like to highlight for the case of Uruguay. The first one is having large liquidity buffers, pre-financing the central government. The second one, having access to contingent credit lines from multilateral institutions. The third one is reducing the share of debt denominated in dollars, because typically when there's a crisis, there's a change in relative prices, and you want that devaluation to be stabilizing and not destabilizing. And finally, a very important margin that several countries have built in is in the maturity of their debt, because typically you have to trade off between issuing in foreign currency or issuing long term. In the case of Uruguay, we've been able to reduce the maturity of our debt to accommodate different preferences of investors without undermining the financial stability in terms of our sovereign debt. So overall, I would say, I would like to highlight throughout this 2 years and a half, the fiscal prudence of the government, the way the margins were built into sovereign debt financing over I would say, the last decade to be able to react to these shocks and minimize its expected impact. And finally, one last thing that we have also emphasized to investors and to multilateral institutions, which is the government was addressing a short-term emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic, but also now the emergency coming from the shocks from the Ukraine war. Yet at the same time, it's very important not to lose sight of longer-term developments. So even when we had a darkened outlook, we kept the high beam headlights on, focused on a sustainable recovery. And having that incorporated into your policy making every day is very important to anchor expectations from the market.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Herman. Mari Carmen, I owe you an apology because I've given these three guys far longer than I gave you. So the word that they've each talked or Cesar didn't mention it, I think, but Patricia and Herman both mentioned what I came across first in a Mexican context, which was called pacification. So I want to give you the chance to talk a little bit, if you want to, or just to quote the numbers to us on these metrics that these guys have talked about, like the reduction in average maturities, the rebalancing towards national currency away from foreign currency, and things of that sort. And then I'm going to stick with you, Mari Carmen, to answer what I hope will be now a slightly more quick fire round of questions when I'm going to ask you about, well, as you can all see, question number 3 on your sheets, having kept telling you it isn't a curriculum. Mari Carmen, do you want to add something about UMS's debt maturity, pacification, and so on?
Sure, thank you. Just a brief recap on fiscal in Mexico. As you know, there was no big stimulus, just around one point of GDP. Our debt profile remained anchored around 50%, and this is a trend that we try to push downwards. And our models are predicting that in coming years, we're going to stabilize the debt at that level. Something that has been very helpful to us was all the refinancing we did. And I think the refinancing risk is something that is coming across. We did a big effort in refinancing all of our maturities up to 2024 in dollars and euros, and we took advantage of the low rate environment for around $10 billion equivalent. So in that sense, this gave us a lot of space to increase our debt maturities profile in external debt. And we are trying to rebalance since last year into more issuance in the local market, in a sense that when COVID started, there was an important issuance in US dollars, and we are trying to rebalance that part. That had been also very helpful to try to reconvert or put together the new debt profile in the portfolio. Also, that is important is that Mexico has, of course, a very deep market, internal market. We have done a lot of efforts with our market makers program, and we have been trying to innovate with different instruments in order to keep the demand from investors, and also to try to match with the market conditions, right? Because fixed debt in this environment is the latest thing anyone would like to buy. So we have been trying to be more creative, and we increased slightly our linkers, that is inflation-linked bonds, and also some floaters which we have turned to price with a fallback rate. We are the first country that are doing that equivalent to SOFR. And in that sense, we have tamed or coped that demand that is actually very, I would say, intermittent in order to keep our issuance in the local program as we have done from last year and on. So that is the lessons learned, and I think that being aggressive on refinancing has helped us a lot as well. In local markets, we have refinanced around $30 billion equivalent. So this is giving us additional space and less liquidity pressures.
Okay, sure. Now, as I said, a little bit more quick fire from all of you. We've all settled into the conversation now. We all know where you're coming from. Some very good metrics being quoted and quite rightly put forward into the public square. But Maria Carmen, let's stick with you. Imagine you're back running the overnight derivatives positions at HSBC. Is there going to be a 50 basis point Fed hike today? And are we all happy with what the dot plot tells us for the end of the year of about 2.5 points? And third question, and quickly from each of you, please, on each of these, are you having contingency plans? You've all talked about the contingency plans from last year that worked out so well this year, but are you putting in place contingency plans for if rates were really to blow out? So Maria Carmen, first to you.
Thank you. Regarding the Fed, actually the curve has priced that and around 175 in the coming meetings. So it's a given that the market is expecting a 50 basis point rate hike. I do think that this is very possible. And I think that the Fed is going to be very, very proactive, probably regarding the bond repurchases. That and this will come through with, we have also Central Bank of England and other central banks coming up next. So this is going to be a strong message, right? Reducing liquidity from buybacks and also hiking rates. Regarding the dot plot, as everybody here has mentioned, it is interesting to see that the biggest risks are on the downside of growth and how quick they are going to contain the inflation in order to not make a hard landing, right? Because growth in the long term could suffer if rating hike cycle is too extreme or too fast. No, we are seeing indicators in the US, the ISM, some that came through this week that are softer than expected. So I think this is going forward going to be data driven, and of course how the outlook on inflation for the central banks and potentially the rebalancing of portfolios, because you know these have shocks on markets, is going to be. And regarding what you mentioned on the contingency plan, I think that actually Mexican government, the Ministry of Finance, have worked a lot on supply-sided measures. Today there was an announcement from the minister regarding inflation. I believe that no one has like the crystal ball to see what can happen next. But what we are seeing in many countries is that some measures have been taken for energy prices. And going forward, it's gonna depend on the demand and supply, what is going to happen with the OPEC, and probably how does the countries going to have a quick response to the energy demands, especially in Europe, no?
Yeah.
And we are having different inflation shocks, no? In the US is more labor, and in Europe is more energy. So we have to put together the two and the impact is going to have in Latin America. And this contingency plan in Mexico is more towards medium to long-term growth. We're very focused in nearshoring and reshoring. Last week, we had an important meeting with many enterprises from the Council of the Americas. And in terms of debt, what we are anchoring is the deficit going forward. And I think that since the infrastructure spending has a floor at 3% at least, this is not going to change from one day to the other, but mid to long term should have a positive impact and on anchoring growth, and also on the other hand, trying to reconfigure the supply chains.
Okay, thank you, Maria Carmen. Patricio, briefly, if you would, short and medium term rates outlook in dollar, and let's tie that in together also with, there were some people, I was reading reports over the weekend, looking at record US inflation and calling it a peak. Are they deluded? Has inflation got a lot longer to run?
Yeah, so I think that, of course, it's not simple to make projection expectation. I think that we are in an environment very volatile. So what we expect in Chile is that the inflation will continue, especially in Chile, but also outside. So in a way to avoid this risk, I think that in our case, we issue in the foreign markets in the first quarter. So we already issue in the external market this year, and we expect to issue during the rest of the year only in local currency. But the rate, of course, increase in the shorter to long run, inclusive in the local markets. And next year, we expect also to access again to the external market in foreign currency bonds. And we will see what's happened and what will be the new market conditions. So I think that we have very high flexibility in terms of DMO, in terms of issuance of currency. We can also make some derivative transaction in order to issue local market and to maintain the currency composition, the target that we have. It's also an alternative. The other alternative also is to increase the foreigner participation in our local currency bonds. We are perform different initiatives to be more to put more interest for the foreign players. We are trying to develop a market maker system, and we perform different book building process. Inclusive, we are trying to see it's possible to perform some LM operation in a very big size in order, for example, to increase our size in thematic bonds. We expect to increase through the LM operation, so to offer to exchange plain vanilla bond with the SLB or the other one. So we have different tools. I think that in the DMO side, in order to make to be prepared for high inflation, that our perception that will be persistent, especially in the foreign market, but also in Chile. So this is basically the position in Chile.
Thanks, Patricio. Cesar, quantitative tightening is the new brilliant idea that somebody has come up with for central banks to wave a magic wand over the problem of wanting to control inflation whilst not wanting to put up interest rates. Have you looked at this phenomenon? Is it something that you understand? Do you understand the likely impacts of it? Is it a useful tool for controlling inflation? I'm talking about global inflation in, let's say, the US.
I think that the combination of rate adjustments, so moving the P, with quantitative adjustments in the United States is probably the most important risk for emerging markets. In Latin America, the rate conditions, or at least in Colombia, but I'm sure Mexico and others, we have a multiplier of 1 to 1. So the rate increases translate immediately, and sometimes it's more than 1. It could be 1.2, 1.3, it depends. So I understand the logic behind the combination of rate increases and quantitative tightening in the United States. I have nothing to say about that. It's their economy, but what I can tell you is that if there is something that keeps us away, to the 4 ladies and gentlemen that are here, is probably that combination and its effects on markets. In Colombia, we have a different approach to fighting inflation. We have 3 tools. For demand side excess, the traditional tool of increasing interest rates, and that is happening. We're already 425 basis points into the normalization phase. But for supply side issues, we have deployed 2 important tools. First is tariff cuts. We reduced to 0 in 2 weeks, more than close to 300 trade items related to food or food inputs. And second, and is also important, we made the decision to smooth out the transmission from high energy prices to local gasoline prices, providing an implicit subsidy to gasoline consumers, both in 2021 and in 2022. So that combination is what, even with that, inflation is running at 8.5% year on year in Colombia. So without those measures, we'd probably be talking about double-digit inflation. So that's how we are fighting inflation again. But the good thing is that we have flexibility. Some other countries are, until now, going to Congress to do fuel subsidies and things like that. At the very least, we had the policies in place to be able to raise rates, reduce tariffs, and provide temporary subsidies on some particular staples.
Okay, thanks, Cesar. Armand, if you want to comment on the global rates environment, by all means do. But I want to move the conversation on by going back a little now to what Mauricio and I were talking about, which is the potential, well, 2 potential positive narratives that have been constructive around the war in Ukraine, insofar as it has an impact on Latin America. But if you want to comment on the rates environment that we've been discussing, by all means do. If not, I'll ask my other question.
Sure, thanks. Let me first mention what we see as our sovereign funding strategy going forward in the context of an increasing interest rate environment. So over the last 2.5 years, since say September 2019, almost 95% of all the total bond issuance of Uruguay has been in local currency. And that has been very important for us because dollarization of our sovereign debt has been the Achilles heel of our sovereign debt structure for almost 2 decades. The last time we issued in the dollar markets on a global amount was in September 2019, before the COVID-19. So that means that, thinking about margins, we have built in the margin to be able to increase our dollar funding without undermining this key credit metric. So going forward, our aspiration, our goal is to be tapping the dollar market. That doesn't mean abdicating on our goal of reducing dollarization, but rather to be able to take advantage of the very strong credit risk perception of Uruguay throughout this period. In fact, we think that part of the reason why our MB spread is low is because there's a scarcity effect, because we haven't added a lot of supply into the dollar market. Now, going forward, what we want to do is link more directly our sovereign financing strategies with our national commitments on climate change. Of the 4 countries that we are represented here in this panel, Uruguay is the only one that hasn't yet issued a thematic bond. I mean, Chile was a pioneer and it has issued both types, use of proceeds and SLBs, and Colombia and Mexico has gone on a use of proceeds approach. However, that doesn't mean that we haven't benefited from very strong ESG credentials of the country.
Apologies for interrupting you, man, but you were rumored to be about to issue a sustainability-linked bond when Patricio suddenly popped up with his.
Yes. And
were those plans well advanced and you put them on hold, or?
No. We've been working on this for 1.5 years, and I think it was great that Patricio and Chile pioneered this SLB for sovereigns, because it has really opened the road, opened the path for other sovereigns to do that and explore other features. But of course, we hadn't yet issued a thematic bond, so we had to build all the infrastructure from scratch. So yeah, there's no holding back. Actually, we are moving forward, and it's taken us, let's say, 1.5 years to be able to be ready. And still, we have work to do. But what I was saying is that even though we haven't issued a thematic bond yet, we have benefited from investors' increased focus on ESG fundamentals of the economy. And that's because the ESG adjusted MB is ever important for investors that are indexing their assets under management to that index. And B, because the weight on Uruguay's on the ESG adjusted MB is twice the one we have on the MB traditional. So for those 2 reasons we think that it pays off for countries to continue to focus on ESG fundamentals over and beyond their thematic bond issuance strategy. And finally, I wanna bring up an issue that I think is very important for us, which is the concept that climate change is a global public good. It's the kind of good that you need concerted action, coordinated action, because sometimes national interests are not enough to provide that. So for example, climate change measures are undersupplied in the market because it's a global public good. And in that sense, I think we need to walk the talk. I mean, if you do pledges and announcements, but you don't follow up with actions, then those are mere words. And an example of the 3 countries here that actually have built into their sovereign debt strategies directly their climate change policies is a manifestation of the walk the talk. Okay. And this is something that Uruguay is also planning on doing.
Okay, good. And I'm sure you'll do it very well. There's no doubt there'll be a lot of demand. I'm watching the clock tick down. I don't know, I mean, we can overrun a little bit, but I don't want to overrun too much from the point of view of yourselves. But let's just shelve the question I was going to ask then about the Latin America as a substitute supplier of grain, Uruguay, rare earths, maybe some other countries, and talk a little bit more about this thematic bond topic, which, as you saw, has been on our agenda. Of course, you've all, as Man says, you've all got experience in ESG, GSS bonds, whatever the alphabet soup du jour is for these kinds of thematic bonds. But it's an appropriate time that a guy from State Street Global Advisors has sent in a question. Well, he's actually sent in an entire agenda for another conference, but just to pick up 1 or 2 points that he's asking. And Patricia, I'm going to ask this to you directly. What metrics, he's talking about ESG bonds and carbon reduction targets, what metrics are you leveraging and how are you managing reporting to demonstrate progress over 5 to 10 year horizons?
Yeah, so the SLB that we issue in March is basically established two targets. The first one is related to our NDC commitment related to reduction of GHG emission. So we have a target by 2030, and the process of verification is basically defined by the United Nations protocol. So we make a report by 2032 to establish our reduction of GHG emission by the end of 2030. And then there is a process of about 1 year performed by a technical team of experts of the United Nations that will check if the number is well correct and following the methodology established by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a very strong institution. And the other target is the increase of non-conventional renewable energy. Also is calculated by an external body. This is the Coordinador Eléctrico from here in Chile. That effectively make the calculation, and the calculation is not related to this transaction or this instrument, is because they make the calculation for the payment to the provider of energy. So this is an independent body that make this calculation. So this is the process. And related to the target, we consider that the second party opinion assess that they are very ambitious, both targets. And the objective of this, as Herman mentioned, effectively is to make a relationship between the financial cost of the government with the commitment of the country related to the fight against the global warming. This is basically the concept. Okay. So the penalty make the incentive for the government to make all the effort in order to reach a target versus to pay the penalty. So this is a strong signal, and we expect to continue to issue this kind of instrument.
Okay, thanks. And Cesar, what's the hardest part of meeting those commitments in green bond targets? What is the hardest thing in the process from your point of view? Briefly, if you would, and then I have a follow-up question to you.
Well, there are two challenges. Many countries and almost all companies that are listed in the S&P 500 have made commitments to carbon neutrality by 2050. So the first thing that you need is money, is to bridge that financing gap between your commitment and the capacity to generate public and private resources to go there, what Herman was calling walk the talk. And for that, the good news is that thematic bonds, green taxonomies, are useful tools to mobilize resources. We estimate in Colombia that with our sovereign bond issuance program and the dynamism that green bonds are having in the private sector, we can bridge half of that funding gap if everything goes according to plan. And the second hurdle to deliver on those commitments is really project selection, scalability, and execution. In the case of Colombia, our best contribution to reducing emissions and adapting to climate change is, for example, arresting deforestation in the Amazon. And it's very difficult to do that in terms of land rights, in terms of security and patrolling of the areas, and so far and so on. So I will point out to do those two challenges. Again, one is resources, and two is project selection and execution. In Colombia, just to mention, we have 4 pillars for our ESG financing strategy. The first one is green bonds. The second one is green taxonomy, what I call a dictionary of what green is. And we launched that in the New York Stock Exchange 2 weeks ago, because it's not all about that. Secretary Janet Yellen said there is not enough public resources to make this transition. You need to attract also equity and investment from the private sector. The third is the incorporation of ESG criteria into public-private partnerships for infrastructure, something we're working on. And finally, carbon markets. The ability to convert Colombia into a net exporter of carbon credits to the world, to the corporate world, and some other states that are interested in the transition.
Okay, and Cesar, very quickly, sticking with you, all year the market's been waiting for you to issue in size from Colombia. There's said to be a $3 billion need. As it gets closer to the election, of course, we're not going to ask you the same questions that I asked Mauricio, but as the election is obviously in everybody's mind, what's holding you back?
When you were asking my colleagues about what is your financing and debt management strategy for this context, the first point in our agenda in Colombia is issue less. We have surprised markets by cutting our financing needs by 3 percentage points of GDP in February.
Good answer. Very good answer.
2, collect more taxes. Our tax collection is increasing year on year, January to April, at 34% nominal terms. So we have collected 1% of GDP in additional current revenue above our forecast. So the more we collect in taxes, the more flexibility we have to adapt our sources. 3, traditionally, Colombia proceeded first with the bonds and then with the multilaterals, because it requires more paperwork to do a multilateral loan than a single bond. This year, we changed the sequence. So we went first with the multilaterals so that we can have more degrees of freedom to observe the market and tap it when it's appropriate. And finally, we have put supply. We have already issued 35% of our local auction program with the benefit of protecting towards foreign exchange risk. And even though the costs are high, yes, that's for sure, and they are high probably in all the countries that we are talking here, but you have the benefit of specify your debt in issuance and in stock.
Very useful insight, Cesar. Thank you very much. Maria Carmen, UMS did the first ever social development goal linked sovereign bond a couple of years ago. Said to be a new thematic bond coming in yen. By all means, tell us specifically what, from SHCP's point of view, is attractive about these kinds of structures. But I want to, as we have to close, just get you to reflect a little bit on this, on the point I made in what I wrote to you all, which is that, you know, when everything is thematic, is nothing thematic? Does it become just an oversupply of the next thing, of the blue bond, of the white bond, of the pharmaceutical bond, of the gender bond? Does it just become, you know, in the end, you know, you need some potatoes with all that meat, don't you?
Sure, that is a very good...
carne sin arroz, como digamos.
That is a very good question. Actually, we do think, yes, we did some issuance in the European markets, and actually this week on Monday we already issue our first peso denominated and were 2 tranches. We are building our local sustainable curve, and we do expect to tap potentially the Japanese yen market in order to start building references in all of the currencies we have. We have a big share of our debt profile. We do think that energy transition need to come together with reduction of social gaps. That is why we started with that part, because you know, our countries are, at least Mexico, very exposed to migration, and also from Central America, and we do need to create as well better conditions as long as the energy transition and what Cesar mentioned, that I'm 100% agree with that, is that there is enough capital to go through only public. And in that sense, the effort and the additional premium that is going to cost for emerging markets in terms of transition has to be translated as a public good, no? And that is something that we have discussed a lot during the spring meetings, because emerging markets experience always higher costs, and you can put the same project together, but for a developed market probably is less expensive than doing it for an emerging market. So a bigger push has to be done in terms of financing and capital mobilization. Now, regarding our bonds, we have a very flexible framework that is aligned to ICMA principles for green, social, sustainable. Right now, we have focused a lot on social, but there is room to start developing something in green, especially forestry, biodiversity, and water programs. And we do think that gender and blue and all these things, at least in the case of Mexico, can be aligned on each budgetary line that is approved by Congress every year. So we can start increasing our share of debt related to these topics. Of course, transparency and incorporating these risks into the balance sheet, making the disclosure is potentially the biggest upside of doing this. No? You are making the budget more transparent, and on the other hand, you are incorporated future risks. That's why we believe that these type of bonds are stable, more stable than the brown ones, because you are doing a full disclosure and reporting what is going on with it.
Okay. Now, people in the audience are asking for all of you if your green taxonomies are publicly available documents, and insofar as they are, or indeed insofar as you have other presentations of your green and social intentions, if you would like OMFIF to help distribute those, just drop me an email, because several people have asked for that in the chat. Now, I know you're all getting itchy feet because it's now 1 minute past the time we're going to finish. I would have loved to have carried on, but unfortunately, your time is not your own and you all have countries to go and run. But I think what's become clear out of this last hour's discussion, and indeed the first half hour's discussion with Dr. Cárdenas, is that there is an awful lot to play for in Latin America. And notwithstanding the fact that there do seem to be, every single day one wakes up another bloody problem after the first one, you know, as if the horsemen of the apocalypse of pestilence couldn't have been followed any more quickly by the apocalyptic horsemen of war. Here we'd find ourselves, but you all have well-managed economies. People talk about political risk in the region, but I'm not sensing any great fear. People were worried about the turnout in Chile, what happened in Chile. People were worried about that as being you know, a risk, a political risk. It does not seem to have become so. I feel reasonably confident that we could say the same thing if what people fear in Colombia, what people are petrified of, I dare say that will turn out to be okay as well. And I always remember Mr. Lula. Back in 2002, people thought the world would come to an end, and hey presto, the sun still shone in Brazil and everything was azul. So please, everybody out there, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I hope you've enjoyed hearing from these directors of public credit from around Latin America, and also from Mauricio earlier on. Please let us know what you think. If you'd like to see more of these things, we'll try to arrange them for you. But my greatest thanks of all, personal thanks and warmest regards to all four of you, to Cesar, Herman, Patricio, and Mari Carmen. Thank you all very much for joining me. Very nice to see you all. And we will meet again in un futuro cercano, digamos, okay? Thank you very much in the near future, guys. Thank you, and thank you to OMFIF for hosting this meeting. Goodbye, everyone.